So I want to give you just a little bit of background before I read. And I'm going to be reading to you passages, actually part of a chapter, from the second volume, from the volume called The Jealous Heart. Now, it's a trilogy. 2 of the volumes are published. The third is not. The second one has just come out. It follows the same characters, or the same general characters, and in particular, a monk named Sati, who was a historical figure mentioned in the Buddha's Buddhist scriptures. Each of these is historically based. These first 2 novels are based on history of the times. In each case, the story of Sati and his fellow monks, there was indeed a monastery in the town city. It was a flourishing metropolis. It's a backwater today, metropolis then. It's called Kosambi. It's on the Yamuna River in the Ganges Plain, just the area of the Buddha. This is located in the time of the stories in the time of the Buddha. Each of these novels winds 2 different themes together, and one is the theme of the monks at the monastery, and the monastery is called Goshida's Park, and the other is a story that takes place, is mainly political, takes place in the court in both novel number 1 and novel number 2. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail except to say in the second novel, which I'm going to be reading from, the story centers on the royal family, and in particular the 3 wives of the king. His name was Udena, and especially 2 of those wives. The bad queen, her name was Meghandia, and the good queen, her name was Samawati. So, and by the way, I'll say that there is a glossary in the back of the book in case these names begin to throw you, because they can really easily throw people. So you're going to see, let's see, Meghandia, Samawati, Udena, all historical characters. There are a few other names mentioned in the passage I'll be reading, but it'll be clear. Let me say that the bad queen, Meghandia, is hatching a plan, and this is according to a legend that Buddhists back in India, in Asia, thought was history. It probably was legend, may not be totally historical, but at any rate, the bad queen is hatching a plan whereby she's really jealous of the good queen, and she is thinking of how she can get rid of her. So all will become clear as I read, I hope. Okay, so the action takes place in 432 BC. This is the time of the Buddha, 432 BC, a long time ago. Okay, the date, September 25th, 432 BC. Talk to mommy. Let's hear you say it. Ooh, keep doing that, darling. Ooh, keep doing that, darling. Queen Meghandia is in her lavishly furnished parlor, instructing her pet Mina. King Udena's second consort is restless. She abandoned her attempt at an afternoon nap, as she has frequently lately. Nights aren't much better. She fears her beauty is being ruined. The Mina, however, is getting much attention. Meghandia has kept a Mina, sometimes 2, ever since she arrived at the palace as a bride. To please her husband, she teaches them a large vocabulary, one that consists mainly of amorous phrases. The king obligingly makes a show of enjoying the little game when he visits on an evening. Though she avoids instruction in curses with which she has an intimate acquaintance, lately she's been adding a stray word or 2 to the creature's linguistic store, like hairpin. She is indifferent as to whether it displays these words or not to her husband. Right now, the bird is peering from his golden cage and is paying more attention to the training session than is his mommy. Her thoughts are running along their tired path, the central tragedy in her life, her childlessness. Her main function as queen is to bear children. Everyone expects it of her. She expects it of herself, but she has failed utterly. In her 30s, she has been married for 13 years, and not even one measly girl. Meghandia has tried everything she knows. She has doggedly seduced her husband, hoping a more amorous union would produce the desired result. She has consulted priests, several in fact, because who knows, some may have more influence in these matters than others. To cover her bases, Meghandia also visits supernatural beings, yakas, farmless beings known to live in certain ancient trees, and nagas, sacred serpents that frequent the Ghats, the landing areas on the banks of the Yamuna, the holy river that generates flourishing commerce in this capital city. Yakas and nagas are known to have the power to make women fertile if they so choose, and if they're properly propitiated. The queen contrives to visit them when she receives her husband's occasional permission to call on relatives in town. Then she makes a secret side trip to a sacred tree on the town's outskirts, or to a ghat, and offers flowers, milk, blessed by a priest, everything she can think of. But all has been futile. Why, she agonized, do the gods hate me? What have I done wrong? When she was young, Meghandia never thought herself evil, but clearly the gods do now. Is this some evil karma from a past life? That would be the conclusion of most people in the subcontinent, who regard reincarnation as a fact of existence. They understand that karma, the law of cause and effect, operates impersonally over lifetimes as a result of one's actions, and they've been taught to accept its consequences, no matter how onerous. Meghandia, however, has her own ideas about how this curse happened, and her response is anything but accepting. Well, she challenges otherworldly beings who might be in the vicinity, maybe you're right. Maybe I am evil. You sent her to steal his affections and humiliate me. You've made her disgustingly fertile and not me. I can't do anything about you, though in fact she intends to continue propitiating, but I can sure as hell do something about that bitch. I can make her life as miserable as she's making mine. Samawati, her nemesis, Udayna's third queen, has already produced 4 royal offspring, 2 of them boys. Who knows how many more are coming after this? Meghandia is convinced that her distress over Samawati's success has made her barren. Otherwise, she herself would have produced an abundance of heirs, not just 2 boys, but at least 3. So when the sickly crown prince died, as everyone knew he would, one of her own sons would be next in line of succession. The only surprise about Prince Kumara's death was that it took so long to happen. The son of the chief consort, Queen Vasaladatta, had been plagued with a circulatory ailment since birth. Always lacking in energy, as a child he was petulant and, as a teen, moody. From the start, cynical courtiers took bets as to when he would die. But nobody guessed right. He lived to the age of 20 and passed in April. After Kumara's death, a special ceremony was needed to proclaim the new crown prince. This was Prince Bodhi, Samawati's son. Although his birth had been joyously celebrated throughout the city, it had not been honored with the pomp that accompanies the birth of a crown prince. So astrologers set the date for the consecration, as they do for all important occasions, and the royal chaplain officiated. Held late in May, before the rains, it was a splendid ceremony, stifling heat notwithstanding. Meghandia will never forget it. The crown prince was seated, sweating, on a platform in the center of the pavilion built specially on the palace grounds. The platform was surrounded by vases containing lustral water, flowers, a small throne, symbolic of the real one he would someday inherit, other ceremonial accoutrements, and a spectacular pile of gifts. Behind him, on the royal platform, sat the proud parents, Udayna leaning over to Samawati, whispering, beaming proudly, even laughing, and regally ignoring the itchy heat rash on his chest. And oh yes, she, Meghandia, was there all right, in the second row. So was Vasiladatta, but in such deep grief for her son that she didn't seem to know or care where she was. Chief consort or not, she could be counted out. It was only herself, Meghandia, who bore the humiliation of that day. It should have been my son. I should have been at the king's side, she raged silently. The gods permitted this atrocity. A wretched merchant girl, the mother of the crown prince. The gods permitted it, but I don't accept it. I was born for better than this. Keep doing that, darling, the bird shrieks. She turns her attention back to him. Such a drab, homely creature. She doesn't approve of brown, or those thick yellow legs, or the bald spot behind its eyes. It's indecent. Her precious should have had the grace of a swan, the plumage of a peacock. Even here I'm thwarted, she fumes. But since the consecration, Samavati, not the bird, has been the target of her thoughts. Samavati and destruction. If she were to divulge her thoughts, people would say she had gone mad. And indeed, the prop that upheld her mind, always fragile, has given way. Her world has closed in, and she has lost all sense of balance. Ooh, keep doing that, darling. She smiles upon the ugly one as she contemplates her cunning. So this is the beginning. It gets worse from there. And this is the royal tragedy that in the seed that is about to unfold. And in this, and I haven't talked in here in this reading about the monks or sati at all, but it weaves in and out throughout the story. So that's the first part of it. So I wanted to say a few words about the time in which this was written, and just to give some historical background, because while we study and practice the Dharma, we don't usually do a whole lot about learning about the time in which the Buddha lived. And I certainly made every effort in this novel and in the other, and what I'm writing now, the third, to make this as historically accurate as possible. And I mean not only the events, but I mean the culture, the life and the times, and how people lived then. And the hope was to create characters that we can relate to today, recognizing that, they have the same characteristics as we have today, same longings, the same demons that eat at them, the same aspirations. So as I go through, I'm going to be making some comments. I'm going to invite you, if you've got questions or comments as we go along, please do ask. I'd like to make this kind of informal, not just me talking about it. First of all, it's not clear from the reading, I think, that this is actually a Buddhist legend. You might say, well, what sounded Buddhist about this? Didn't sound very Buddhist, I'm sure, to you. But what's Buddhist about it is that Meghandia was in the legend, hated the Buddha. It wasn't clear in this writing. Why did she hate the Buddha? Because according to the legend, her father, when she was very young and unmarried, had gone to the Buddha and proposed that he marry his beautiful daughter, and they were Brahmins of very high order. And the Buddha said, what? He said, I wouldn't, what's the body? It's just filled with pus and urine or something. Totally untactful, I guess you would say. But anyway, the bottom line was it was no. I won't marry her. And according to the legend, Meghandia conceived a grave hatred for the Buddha. So she became the bad queen, and Samavati is the good queen. Samavati is a follower of the Buddha, and that's clear from volume 1, by the way, historically true. She was designated by the Buddha to be the woman who was foremost in loving kindness. So she was a good queen. So all of this is a playing out of a good queen and a bad queen. And in this case, the bad queen wins. Historically, I would just say that this legend that this book is based on was written probably about 400 AD. That was 800 to 900 years after the Buddha lived, after he died, probably something like that. And it was created down in Sri Lanka. So it's quite a while after the Buddha's life. Now, the creator was probably a monk, and he said he based this on history and all kinds of whatever it was. There's not a whole lot of evidence for that. But maybe, who knows? We don't know. There's no documents to show, but this was his claim, that this is historically accurate. Okay, so we can take it there. By 400 AD, when he created this, it was pretty clear that what was becoming Hinduism, it was evolving, was gaining really dominance in India. And it may well be, and this is just conjecture, that he was looking up to India, seeing that Buddhism was in a pretty fragile position, and maybe he was bitter. That's just a thought. He made it, according to the legend, Meghandia was animated by a hatred for the Buddha, and that's why she went out and set about to kill Samawati. I thought, wow, that is way too superficial. And so I added in childlessness, which in fact, if there's any historical truth to this at all, I would assume that childlessness has got to be part of it. A tremendous, tremendous pressure on women to bear children. And you can imagine in a royal family what that has to be. This is how their credibility is on having children, male children. Forget female so much, male children. And she didn't have any, is the way I saw. I thought this would make it a more credible novel, credible character. So she had none. She produced no heirs. Udena, the king, had multiple wives, 3 of them. And it's very possibly true because kings in those days did, as we know, we don't have to look far in Western history to see the same thing. And you think of Henry VIII as an example, all of his wives. Well, Udena had 3, and then there was a murder right in the midst of all at the same time. That was the difference with Henry VIII. He did sequentially, and Udena and the other kings were doing it simultaneously, plus a harem, all of that at the same time. Udena was king of a kingdom in northern India along the Ganges where the Buddha lived and where he taught. And his kingdom was called Vamsa. And so that was historically true. So as I said, I try to bring as much historical detail into these novels as I can, like the Mina, the bird that she was teaching and training. This was amongst the aristocracy. This is what women who were vastly underemployed, those who were aristocrats, would train birds, minas were one, to talk. So she didn't have children. What else? Your heart kind of goes out to this woman. What else did she have to do? She couldn't go out and work or anything like that. Yeah, Cora.
Just to what you just said, your heart kind of goes out to this woman. That's what I'm curious about. In just that little snippet that you had, she doesn't seem to have very many redeeming qualities.
She doesn't.
She doesn't. So is there anything that would evoke some kind of compassion?
Not in her. Yeah, if you're going to have compassion, it can't be because she's a nice woman. She wasn't.
But is there a way with compassion do you see somehow into her loss? Here we see her saying bitch, and we see her saying teaching the earth is sort of lascivious things, and so you sort of you seem to be setting up the Virgin Mary versus the whore. I was wondering if there was anything that.
So why would one's heart go out to her? Just thinking, recognizing the tremendous pressure on her. Here she was a childless woman. She thought it was her fault. She was doing everything she could to produce children, to have a child, to become fertile. She couldn't do it. She felt the gods were against her. She had the whole deck stacked against her. She cracked. She was never bright anyway. This is the way I'm portraying her. She was not very bright. And everything was stacked against her, and she just cracked. Yeah, and this is something I think that, the heart can identify with and say, oh God, what if we were in that situation? the women. And if you're a man, you maybe put yourself in that situation also. But whatever. Yeah, that's why. Yeah. So I said historical details. I mentioned Bodhi, the crown prince. Historically, he perhaps did not have a half-brother who died before him. Historically, and he was a historical figure, he did become king after he was the son of Udena and did indeed become king. The description of the consecration is probably historically accurate. I mean, the way it was set up. It wouldn't have happened when he was a young man. It would have happened at his birth, but that's the way they did it. About the Buddha's dates, no one knows for sure. It used to be that we know that the Buddha lived to be 80 years old. This we know from historical scripture. The traditional dates of the Buddha's life, that is, ones that everybody popularly had accepted as kind of provisional but likely, was 568 to 480, pardon me, 563 to 483 BC. More recently, scholars revised it and said, wait a minute, we think he was born earlier, later than that. And so they were placing the dates at 490 to 410, 80-year span. Those are the dates I chose because that was the prevailing theory when I started writing these books a few years ago. More recently, back in 2013, archaeologists uncovered a shrine in Nepal that really dates, which I think is the Buddha's birthplace. That's what they think. And they dated it back, they dated his lifetime back to probably around the earlier dates, like the 6th century BC or something like that. So who knows? But in my stories, it's 490 to 410 BC. Now, the Buddha lived at a time called the Axial Age. And the Axial Age was a time of tremendous change, not only in the Indian subcontinent, but it through a great portion of the world. At that time, the ancient religion that prevailed in India was called the Vedic Tradition, that had been brought by the Aryans into India when they conquered India and drove a darker people, south. And the Vedic tradition was basically a tradition that was performed only by Brahmin priests. They were the only ones who were allowed to perform the ceremonies. And it was a series of chants. The Aryans had developed, let's say, religious chants to the gods, of which there were several, to propitiate the gods. And they would chant these during their holy rites, which were basically sacrifices. They slaughtered animals, sacrificed animals in a way that ancient peoples often did. So since only Brahmins, the priests, could do it, this tradition was also called Brahmanism. This was the tradition from which Hinduism developed. Modern Hinduism. The modern Hinduism was in the process of developing, at the time of the Buddha. There was, in other words, this great malaise. Also developing, people began questioning, because the Vedic tradition became so narrow. It was just Brahmins chanting to the gods, and clearly it didn't work. So people were getting a little bit cynical, and so a lot of people were going out and looking for other answers. The Buddha was one of those. And there were many ascetics that were around in the rural countryside. Many different teachings and schools of thought in the countryside, in the rural areas. Buddhist was one. A lot of different dharmas. The Buddha Dharma was one of those, what we now practice. In addition to that, there was superstition. And in the passages I read, I talked about the superstition. That was ancient. It was from a folk religion, predated Vedism. It was simply what the popular people believed, and that meant you went and the sacred trees, that they still are in India in rural areas. A sacred tree, or the ghats, the landing areas along rivers, sacred places. And these were places where people would go and pray. And this is what the Queen did here. This was also a time when class hierarchy had already begun to form. As part of the myth that the Brahmins brought with them into India, that people were divided into class, and of course they put themselves on top, as conquerors always do. And however, in the time of the Buddha, the Brahmins weren't invariably on the top. It was the Brahmins and the warrior class, the rulers. The Buddha came from the warrior class. And underneath that were merchant class and the peasantry. And so all of that structure existed. And in the passages I read, you heard some of that where the queen, Meghandia, calls the other queen, Samavati, she calls her a wretched merchant girl. In fact, that's the history, that Samavati came from the merchant class and married the king. It wasn't as rigid, the class structure wasn't as rigid then as it later became. It was a little bit more fluid, and yet it was kind of rigid. And part of it included those who had no class. That's the outcasts, which we know of these days. If we know anything about India, I think we've all heard about the outcasts. Now, today, these days, outcasts, it is illegal to discriminate against outcasts. In fact, though, it still happens. There's just been some gruesome stories about discrimination against Dalits, the outcasts in India, currently in rural India. But at any rate, that was even worse than being at the lower range realm of the class order. The theory was, whatever your class you were born into, this is where you were. It was better, according to the religion of Vedism, to act out your own role poorly of your own class than to be able to perform well the role of another class. Social mobility, they were trying to just cut off. Is that clear? In other words, you didn't, okay, so if you were born as a warrior, as a merchant or a peasant, no way were you going to be a Brahmin. Even if you were terrible in your profession as a warrior, or if you were an awful farmer. Say you had a real penchant for religion and you wanted to chant and you were deeply devoted. No way. You could not do that. You would be discriminated against. It just wasn't permitted. So it was a very rigid in its way of being, and became more rigid as time went on in the centuries after the Buddha's death. So I wanted to say a few words about how what the Buddha taught differed and how it was the same, and it's just got to be a really few words, from the tradition of India. And one of the things is karma. I mentioned the concept of karma in here in the passages that I read about Meghandia saying, well, she's got evil karma, probably came from some past life. This was the understanding that people carry with them the actions from past lives. So if you led a terrible life before, you were going to suffer in the next life. And they believed that. They did believe that. And I think, I mean, impressionistically, a lot of people, we may not believe in past lives, but we've got the feeling that, that there is something that might be, if you're not carried over, at least certainly you see it in this life, right? As you sow, so shall you reap. So karma played over in a past life and in the current life. But in that culture, past lives, and currently as well, they believe that you have past lives. I will say that we, as Westerners, do not have to believe in past lives to practice the Buddha Dharma. There's no obligation. But certainly at that time they did. Now there was a difference. People traditionally in the Vedic tradition believed that in reincarnation, that there's kind of a pretty much a body that's kind of reformed in some way. The Buddha said, no, it's rebirth. And there's a difference. Rebirth is a being in your karmic stream. If you were born as a particular kind of person, say a Brahmin, doesn't mean you're born as a Brahmin male again, according to the Buddha. It's a being in this karmic stream. I mean, it's very vague. I can't explain it. And so if you feel puzzled, I'm sorry. So am I. It's not all that clear. But there is a distinction between the way reincarnation and rebirth And the Buddha taught rebirth. And it isn't a being that is born again, the same one in the next lifetime. But he did think that, and the belief was, you inherit. As you sow, so shall we reap. And not only in the lifetime, but across lifetimes. Barbara?
So did the Buddha believe that, by practicing the Dharma that you could overcome your karma?
Absolutely. That was the huge, wonderful question. That's exactly right. If you practice the Dharma, and we start with the precepts, right? And you start building up a wholesome life, and the idea is that you're cleaning up your karma. We don't say that much, I think, in our tradition, but I know in Zen, and I lived for a while in a Zen monastery, and this is a big deal, cleaning up your karma. Yeah. And the idea is that, and we do not have to think about it in terms of many lives. And that's not what they were talking about in the Zen monastery either. But it was about living a wholesome life. And let's face it, it makes a whole lot of sense. Isn't that what we talk about all the time? Becoming clearer, more wholesome in your actions, leading to freedom. It just it's common sense. We don't have to get into discussions about karma, about it. But the Buddha, that was part of his tradition and what he inherited. Non-harming. In our tradition, it's a big, do not harm. Now it's believed that the Buddha may well have been influenced by the Jain, Jain tradition. It may not have been a thought that originated with the Buddha, but whatever it is, certainly non-harming became a major tenet in the Buddhist Dharma. And you can see what that would mean. It would mean also that he was very much opposed to the sacrificial rites, right? A huge sacrifice, state-sponsored sacrifice. Hundreds of animals would be slaughtered. The Buddha didn't approve. This is not what the Buddha approved of. And not only non-harming, so this was new. It wasn't from the context of the culture. Also new, mindfulness. The Buddha practiced, as we know, and I think we've talked about it here before, he did practice the jhanas, non-ordinary states of consciousness. We've talked about it a lot. I don't want to go into it because I'll never do it justice in our few minutes. That was traditional. A lot of these wandering ascetics really did master the jhanas, the non-ordinary states of consciousness. But they hadn't been practicing mindfulness, being present in the present moment. And this is something the Buddha talked about, and which is certainly a main tenet in what our practices are. And a third element that I think really bears talking about and thinking about is loving kindness. The Buddha spoke about, he called them the Brahma Viharas, the abode of the gods, the wholesome heart states. Loving kindness was like the pivot upon which compassion, and that's loving kindness to a person who is suffering, or sympathetic joy, that's loving kindness for a person who is experiencing something wonderful, and equanimity, it kind of peaks them all. Whether it is suffering joy, holding it all with even-handedness. This is the Buddha. It was new to the Buddhist tradition. Now, here in the West, we talk much. This is really important to us, and I think, and I've said it before, I think that the Buddha should have called it the ninefold path, not the eightfold path. I think loving kindness was just as important as every other aspect in the eightfold path. So these are some of the major ways that the Buddha differed from the culture in which he lived, and which his dharma was different. Oh, there's so many other things. Like, he allowed people, he dropped the class discrimination. He even allowed outcasts to ordain and become part of the Sangha. This is revolutionary. And then, and we can't get into a big discussion, he allowed women, by God, into the Dharma. This was like, oh, Lord, incredibly inflammatory. Why? Because the men didn't want their wives going off, right? It's okay if some of the men went off From the men's point of view, it was okay. Not from the women's point of view. From the men's point of view, it was okay. But the truth was, once the men went off, women whose husbands left were considered widows. And believe me, you don't want to be a widow in India. Now, it became worse over time. But that's why it is understood that many of the women whose husbands went off later followed their husbands and became nuns. Why? The Buddha was known as a widow maker in his time. And this is a phrase among the women. So that's why many of the women went. I mean, what else were they going to do? And he discriminated against. It became worse after the Buddha, but even in his time, it was not an enviable position to be a widow. So many things he did knew, and of course you can't do anything in this world without having, reaction, negative, positive, and he went through it. So I suppose great gratitude to the Buddha for what incredible genius, there's no question, a spiritual genius. I would like to just say a few words about my experience with creativity. It is something that continues to surprise me. It came to me as an utter surprise to write these novels. As many of you know, I hadn't planned it. I was sitting in a retreat. They were discussing one of the Buddha's scriptures, and happened to be the one that mentioned this monk Sati. And Sati was an outcast, and he was being berated by the Buddha, and I thought, this is terrible. Somebody needs to write something about it. And then I thought, somebody really should write maybe a novel about it. I thought, hey, that's a great idea for somebody. And then I thought, well, maybe I ought to do it. And then I said, not me. But I didn't know anything about the era, all of that research and all of the everything. It didn't sound like something I was interested in. But the bottom line was, yes, I did. But it's been a continual surprise that I don't know where it comes from. It's not like I don't work. It's not like the voice comes down from outside and speaking to me and I'm just transcribing. But it is just an incredible, and I think all of you who know anything, experience creativity in the arts or any other area, know what I'm talking about. This just utterly surprising and feeling that this is not just this is not just me in here. This is something where I'm listening and it's just expressing. What I want to do, in fact, in the future, is have some evenings where not my voice and reading, but from some of you who are engaged in some of the arts, will have an opportunity to offer your own both artistic expression and comments about how the Dharma and creativity have worked together. And the first night I will be facilitating that, will be in September on the 20th, and Barbara Martin is going to be offering her music, and Joan is going to be offering reading from her book, and both will be talking about the Dharma and creativity. And so I hope it's going to be something that'll be a wonderful evening.